plan for the evening is, and I promise we'll be done before midnight, is that I told Jon Pahl, I just told him now, that there are a couple of questions that I want to ask him. They are questions he has no doubt answered because they're based on my read of his book. And they're fairly fundamental, but my hope and expectation is that you will be inspired by his answers to the questions to then buy 5 or 6 copies of his book so that you can have one in the car instead of texting, and one in your office, and one in the bathroom, and one in the dining room, and so on. Because you'll get into more details, obviously, in the book itself. So my first obvious, simple, straightforward question, John, is why are you writing? What prompted you to write this book?
Well, as any project of this magnitude, there were a variety of motives behind my writing. The primary one was I was looking for a new project. This is how scholars work, right? We wrap one thing up and we ask, okay, what's next? And the book that I just finished was entitled Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. And it was a painful book to write because it was a book about how religions can get perverted, how that religions can produce harm, how religions are complicit in violence, in the U.S., especially along the lines of age, race, and gender. And so I thought, okay, let me write a book on a happier topic. Yes, I know the ironies are pretty ample, right? And I began writing about researching religious peace builders, studying the emergence of religious peace building, mostly in the 20th century. Basically from Mohandas Gandhi to Lima Bowie, the Liberian peace activist who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. So that was the scope. And then in 2006, I first heard the name Fethullah Gülen. And the more I studied religious peace builders, the more sense it made to me that Fethullah Gülen fit in that narrative as one of these religious peace builders. And then I was at a conference at the University of Chicago, and Saeed Qaboos from the Gülen Institute in Houston said, we're thinking about authorizing a biography on Hoj Effendi. Would you be interested in writing it? And I said, yes. And that was the beginning of the research project.
So it wasn't 2010? It was 2010. So this is 6 years before the fake news.
Yes, right. In 2010, still, Mr. Gülen had been voted one of Time's 100 most influential, and a couple years after that. But things were hunky-dory in Turkey, and we had made a trip to Turkey sponsored by the Dialogue Forum in Philadelphia, my wife and I, in 2007. That was lovely. And, out of that experience, the more I became familiar with people close to Mr. Gülen, the deeper my trust in them developed. And the more I realized that, these are folks on the side of the better angels of our nature. And so when Saeed asked me to do this, I said yes, again, thinking it would be a happier project than the one I had undertaken before, not having any clue, what was coming down the road. Although I should have been aware, because it's a red thread that runs like, throughout the history of religions, that those people who are most peaceful, most loving, most dedicated to peace are vilified, slandered, and persecuted. It's a red thread throughout the history of religions. And unfortunately, Mr. Gülen has again, and people inspired by him have also fallen under that curse.
So, apropos of diverse religions, the number 5 is always a good number, isn't it? So you have 5 pillars of Islam, and you have 5 wounds in Christ's body, and you have 5 books of the Torah, and in your book you have 5 principles that you associate in particular with Gülen, and will you share those with us?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. The 5 chapters of the book, so they're right here in the table of contents for you to follow. And the structure of the book is both chronological, that is, it moves through Mr. Gülen's life from his birth in a tiny little rural village, Korajok, in 1938, down to his residence at the retreat center in Pennsylvania, where he continues to live and thrive, thanks God. And then the book is also organized around these 5 themes or topics. And the 5 topics are what I call seeds of peace. That is, these are things that I recognize that are found across historic traditions among peace builders that also happen to be evident in Mr. Gülen's life and in the institutions and agencies begun by people that he has inspired. And so the 5 are, in order, learning. And by learning, I don't just mean a sort of narrow definition of literacy in Western sense, but learning in a sense of symbolic facility. And Mr. Gülen emphasizes frequently that learning has to be with 2 wings. We have to fly with 2 wings. And by that he means literacy both in the canons of Western science, the Enlightenment tradition basically, Kant and so forth, but also facility in the learned discourses and practices of the tradition. And for him, obviously, that's the truth of the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, the big tradition of Islam. So flying with 2 wings, learning, overcoming the warfare between science and religion. I mean, that's a huge source of conflict in our world, that misunderstanding and misperception and distortion and of the 2 sides by each other. So learning is number 1. Second is participation in the nonviolent practices at the very core of Islam, and his teaching of those, especially as a mosque teacher in Izmir. So his first appointment, or his third appointment, in fact, back was as a Quran teacher at Bistana Bazar Mosque in Izmir. So he was teaching Quran, but he was also teaching the nonviolent practices, the 5 pillars of the faith, the Shahada, what the Hajj means, what fasting during Ramadan is all about, how charity is best engaged, and of course, prayer. Now, prayer is a particularly important example in this regard, and we haven't really studied well what prayer does to human beings. And I'm particularly interested in the way prayer contributes to peace building, and the way prayer promotes a pro-social brain. All right, this is my hypothesis, that the reason prayer endures and what prayer does for us is helps us get beyond the animal capacity, or the animal instincts of fight or flight, and into something that is demonstrably human, that is using our communicative resources and language, most notably, because prayer is always communicated in embodied language. So it's personally meaningful, changing the brain, and also it's a demonstration of sociability. In other words, we pray with others too. And Mr. Gülen's practice of prayer emphasized intentionally that prayer must be undertaken with sincerity. He goes so far as to say that if you're doing your prayer and you're just going through the motions and simply repeating words for the sake of repeating them, do it again until your heart is really present, right? And it seems to me that emphasis on practices like that contribute to peace building, and his integrity in those practices is what drew people to him in Izmir in the 1960s. The third chapter then is about the seed of peace that I call engaged empathy. Mr. Gülen was known as someone who cried. That is, when preaching, he would break down in tears. Yes, right. And it's a great thread of conversation, and I look forward to questions and conversation about that as well. And so people in a mosque would cry with him as well. So you have this entire congregation sobbing. Now, as a historian of religions, you hear something like that, and you go, oh, no, that's interesting. What in the world is going on there, right? And Mr. Gülen's own explanation of it is simply, well, I guess God, that's how God made me. Which, of course, is a very modest sort of deflection of what in fact is going on, which is, this empathic capacity to recognize the suffering of the world. And he goes on to explain as well, especially the suffering of Muslims around the world, who he perceives as fallen behind in many areas of life. And so that perception of suffering, that empathic awareness of suffering on the one hand, but if you just leave people with the emotion, that's not enough. Movements don't begin just with empathy, right? There also has to be engagement. And so he combined in his preaching and teaching both this capacity for empathy, that is recognizing, as the Buddha puts it, that life is suffering, the first noble truth within Buddhism. All right? And so that awareness on the part of Mr. Gülen then translated into practical action. Again, flying to wings, both the heart, but also the head. Practical, pragmatic rationality, building institutions. And that's what began to emerge as his reputation grew and as he began circulating around the Aegean region, preaching in lots of different pulpits and meeting lots of different people. And the first institutions to get started were dormitories, or lighthouses, that would house students coming mostly from the Anatolian heartland into Izmir initially, and to other cities then very quickly, so that they could undertake studies and also continue to practice their faith. All right, and again, that's the sort of combination of empathy, recognition of suffering, the potential for suffering, and practical action to address it. The fourth chapter then, the fourth seed of peace, is what I call principled pluralism. And principled pluralism means, so you know who you are. As a person, you know your tradition. You're schooled in the tradition, and Mr. Gülen is deeply grounded as a Muslim, right? In the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, the Sunni, broad stream of the tradition. I mean, he represents the mainstream of Islam, along with the depth of Sufi traditions. I mean, it's really an extraordinary combination. I'm not an expert on Islam, so forgive me, but my perception is that there's an awful lot that he has imbibed from the riches of the tradition, across the range of it, and can communicate to others as well. So principled, but also pluralist, that is open to anyone who happens to come along. And early in his teaching in Izmir, Mr. Gülen started holding Q&A sessions, mostly attended by college students, where any question whatsoever was on the table, with two exceptions: politics and questions about individuals. Right? Now, those are both principled decisions and prudential decisions on his part. But as far as pluralism goes, the principle here, and the organizing principle of this chapter, is hoshguru, which literally means to see nicely. Right? And hoshguru usually gets translated as tolerance. So Mr. Gülen's best known book is Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Hoshguru, tolerance, right? But Scott Alexander from Chicago said once, he actually gave a paper that I heard in Accra, Ghana. They've been asking him to send me the version of the actual text of, and he's never actually done so. But it's a paper I'll never forget, and I always want to give him credit for this. He said, hoshguru means to see another as God sees them, which means with eyes of mercy and compassion. And that means, well, you're non-judgmental in your approach to another person. And how that manifested itself in practice is that people inspired by Mr. Gülen, especially the Journalists and Writers Foundation, one of these institutions that was built by people inspired by him, began holding dialogues. Right? In Istanbul, the first one was, I believe, 1995 in November. It was an iftar dinner, 1,000 people at the Renaissance Pullman Hotel in the Sea of Marmara in Istanbul, and atheists, communists, leftists, rightists, nationalists, political Islamists, all together in one room together, listening to Mr. Gülen as the keynoter talk about hoshguru. All right, so that's the fourth of the chapters, and those are his years in Istanbul in particular. The dialogue initiatives associated with people of Hizmet. And then the final chapter focuses on, it's entitled Hizmet Global. And it focuses on, so service global, but it's really about the sort of organizational genius that Mr. Gülen inspired. And it's a really very modest principle in many ways. Istishara is the term. And it means mutual consultation. In other words, the genius at the heart of the Hizmet movement and Mr. Gülen's example is to empower people to listen intently to others' ideas and to incorporate those ideas and then try them out, right? In other words, robust debate with one another about particular initiatives is at the heart of this mutual consultation. I describe it in practical terms as a version of economic life. I use a set of economic terms to describe it because people often ask, okay, where did the money come from? In connection to these various enterprises. And I say they're really much like social enterprises. And so if you think about Istishara practically in application, it's not capitalism, certainly not in just the neoliberal version of capitalism, the greed is good model. It's not socialism because it's not statist, but it definitely takes from socialism the attempt to solve problems with the wealth that gets generated. And it takes from capitalism the idea that wealth does, in fact, solve the problem of poverty. And so it seems to me, once again, it's one of these examples of Mr. Gülen, people inspired by him, trying to fly with two wings, neither capitalist nor socialist, but a third way. So those are the 5 seeds of peace. Learning nonviolent practices, the core of Islam, engaged empathy, principled pluralism, and social enterprise.
Which brings me to the obvious next question, because particularly given the events of 2016, the events of 2013, events happening on the ground even today in and outside Turkey, and the misconception that many people have that Mr. Gülen and Mr. Erdogan were like that at one point, and there was a schism. Of course, it's a misconception, but aside from it being a misconception, the fundamental underpinning of the misconception is that Erdogan is a political animal, and the kind of Islam that he is trying to inject into Turkey is a political Islam, whereas Gülen stands for and teaches and talks about civil Islam, which is why that was one of the 2 questions they couldn't ask, politics. So can you talk a little bit about Gülen's thinking and civil Islam?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If my talk tonight were a talk, right? The title I was going to give it was going to be Cutting Through the Propagandistic Paradigm. The authentic Fethullah Gülen. Because the fact of the matter is, Mr. Gülen has been framed by a narrative that has been shaped over the course of Turkey's contemporary history through various regimes, all of whom have framed him in similar fashions. That is, as someone who is an enemy of the state, who is the leader of a religious cult, right? And who is now an armed terrorist and a leader of an armed terrorist organization, right? That's the narrative that has been generated through repeated military coups in history, after each one of which Mr. Gülen was targeted with these accusations and imprisoned, right? So 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997, and now 2016, right? The narrative has stayed the same that seeks to frame him, right? Repeatedly, time after time after time, with simple ratcheting up of the stakes. I mean, it's unprecedented what has happened now to people of Hizmet in Turkey. So the kind of human rights violations that have been occurring in Turkey are of a new order, right, in Turkish history, although none of the coups were pretty. And people were executed, imprisoned, etc. But how to break through that narrative that keeps getting repeated like an Orwellian big lie, it necessitates us to take some steps back to understand how that narrative can be persuasive to so many, both within Turkey and around the globe. And I think in order to do that, we have to address some pretty critical presuppositions about our own point of view and perspectives. And those are as follows. Number one, religions always produce violence or lead to violence. In other words, the secular frame that perceives religion as, first of all, a problem, rather than as a source of social capital and cultural good and cultural power. Right? Secondly, that religious leadership tends to be authoritarian or charismatic in structure. And third, that ultimate power is economic or political. And I think all three of those assumptions are errant, actually, historically, or they are certainly debatable at least, but they are the three assumptions that seem to me underlie this narrative that scapegoats Mr. Gülen as an armed terrorist, leader of a religious cult, enemy of the state, or leader of a parallel state, if you want to put it in that way. And so how to cut through those presuppositions in order to get to the authentic Fethullah Gülen is the challenge, I think, that I see the biography trying to address by proposing a different paradigm based on the evidence. I don't hide the fact that I admire Mr. Gülen, I admire people of Hizmet, but I'm also not naive about religion's capacity to produce violence. I wrote a book about, religions and violence in the United States. I've been studying it for 6 years with a chair of the American Academy of Religions study group on religions, conflict, and peace. I know what the markers are of religious violence. And they're not evident in his life and teaching, or in the factual institutions that have been initiated by people inspired by him. Okay, what are we talking about? What kind of institutions and initiatives are we talking about? We're talking about schools, math and science academies in 140 different nations around the globe. We're talking about dialogue centers, think tanks, academic conferences, trips to Turkey, and now to other places as well. In other words, practices of hospitality. And we're talking about social businesses that demonstrably lifted people out of poverty, not only in Turkey, but now in 140 different countries around the world. That's the authentic Fethullah Gülen, and the narrative that we have to somehow get out there and break through, because it's the narrative that's true to the evidence, rather than that conforms to a frame imposed by authoritarian governments seeking to perpetuate their fragile power. All right? Sorry. The preacher just came out of me for a minute there. All right.
How about Hizmet? I'm just giving you a chance to say it.
It's a hard word. It's a hard word for someone like a Westerner like me to say. Hizmet, Gorba. Thank you.
Because I remember the first conference that I went to, and like the second or third paper that was given, I said, wait, this word tolerance, because that's all I had seen of it. I said, tolerance means this, I'm here, you're there. And is that what you're talking about? Because that's not good. And then someone said, no, that's just a bad translation.
It sure is, yeah.
Which is this, it's a even playing field. So I'll give you a chance with Hizmet as well.
Hizmet. How's that? Don't try it. Anyway, it usually gets translated as nostalgia. Also not a particularly good translation. Orhan Pamuk in Istanbul, his memoir of the city talks about how when there's fog over the Bosphorus, and you wake up in the morning and it just hangs there, that's Hizmet.
Right.
Thank you. that sort of sense of gravitas associated with this culture that has such richness and depth and history, and going back millennia in continuity. I mean, there's a reason that Istanbul was simply called the city for thousands of years, because it's that incredible place. Now, in Gülen's life, that Gülen,
Does it have another twist?
yes, it certainly does. In other words, if left simply by itself, that can be despairing and paralyzing, right? But again, fly with two wings. That is, fly with two wings. And so it turns into, instead, community, right? And the solution to this huzun is found when you go into the depths of the despair, through it in a way, and then the entire community sort of breaks open for you. Just like as the sun comes up over the Bosphorus, the fog clears away, and you have this beautiful city sparkling around you with all of the sights and sounds of this bustling place, the city. So in Gülen's life, clearly he was able, again, to identify with that sense of nostalgia for what is lost in Turkey's history, and there's much that's been lost. The Ottoman Empire was one of the casualties of colonialism. Let's just say that. It also had its own internal problems, dynamics that led it to fall. Right? But what then comes out of that collapse, that despair, that huzun, right, is the question that Turkey is continuing to struggle with today, as I reckon it. And the temptation, it seems rather clear to me, throughout Turkey's history, has been to resort to a parroting or a mirroring of Western nationalism, even if overlain with political Islam, as in the current manifestation. And so that resurgence of nationalism as an attempt to resolve this nostalgia, this sense of loss, is, as I see it, a temptation to which, unfortunately, Turkey, like many other nations around the globe, has resorted in recent years.
And I'm curious, I have my own thoughts, I'm curious about yours. For Gülen himself, in Brazilian Portuguese there's a word saudades, but that refers to my longing for Brazil.
Yeah.
Because I'm living elsewhere.
Sure, great jazz song.
Exactly. So I imagine for Mr. Gülen, who's been here for now 20 years, who came here initially for medical reasons, and essentially his physicians have said, you can't go back, and that was even before things got bad with Erdogan.
That's right.
Because the Sturm und Drang, to use an old Turkish phrase, would not be good for your heart. Do you get the sense, here's the man who when he prays, he weeps, do you get the sense of a longing for Turkey as well? Or is he so beyond that particularization that he can refocus on the positive without even letting himself drag down?
Yeah, no, and the most honest answer is I don't know. I mean, one of the things I struggled with in writing the biography is to tell the story of an individual who doesn't really want his story told. Or he doesn't want his story at the center. Right? Because as a Muslim, as a Sufi, his aim is the annihilation of the ego. Fana. Right? And so I wanted to respect that in the kind of biography that I wrote. So I didn't get in, certainly in the questions that I asked him, too much about these questions of his subjectivity. I can tell you this. I know that a plot has been purchased for him in Pennsylvania, and his expectation is that he will rest in Pennsylvania. Yeah. I think he has profound sadness about what's taken place in Turkey. It would only be natural that he would long for those green spring days of an Istanbul summer, right? As he wrote, a poem entitled Exile, right? So that he struggles with. But I think he also has turned, and one of the central principles that he's taught throughout his life is, mushpet autocrats, consistent positive action. And it also happens to be one of the central principles of nonviolence. Walter Wink, in his Jesus and Nonviolence, says, the central principle of nonviolence is do not react to evil, do not mirror evil. And it seems to me that something like that has been very much what drew people to Mr. Gülen, is consistent, positive encouragement, empowerment of people to a different model of power than political or economic power, but rather, truly, the cultural power found in our religious traditions.
And later in your book, you talk about the long horizon.
Yeah.
Can you just spin that out a little bit more?
Sure. Maybe I can just read.
That'd be great. And then we're going to open it up for questions.
Sounds like a plan. So, the last few pages of the book. Okay. In one of his many speeches to friends as troubles began to escalate in Turkey, Fethullah Gülen interpreted a famous Quranic passage that reads, "Whatever good happens to you, it is from God, and whatever evil befalls you, it is from yourself." According to Gülen, what this passage pointed toward is that we may not always clearly see the underlying reasons behind events. In such cases, of which the current oppression of people of Hizmet surely was one, it was wisest to turn inwards, toward self-criticism, and to turn always toward forgiveness from God. Quote, "Blaming oneself for troubles and misfortunes depends on a consciousness of serious self-criticism. This in turn depends on a sound faith in God and the day of judgment." End quote. Gülen's perspective throughout his life again had consistently kept a horizon of eternity before believers' eyes. But, he went on, even better than any post-trouble turn toward self-criticism was patient striving on the path of goodness. Quote, "I wish that, instead of struggling to restore their hearts and spiritual lives, people could build up barriers against their destruction from the very beginning, for it is very difficult to restore something after it has been destroyed." End quote. There were those within Hizmet who scrutinized their own behavior and relationships in the wake of events in Turkey after 2010, and especially after July 15, 2016. Just as there were others who persevered in patient work as teachers, dialogue activists, and social entrepreneurs. But these practices were nothing new for them. And no matter how they responded to their oppression in Turkey, Gülen and many people of Hizmet knew that their hope for restored Turkish democracy had dim probability of being realized by almost any reckoning of short-term history. Gülen reserved a plot in a cemetery in Pennsylvania, expecting never to return to Turkey again. And yet, he kept hope nonetheless. This too was nothing new for Gülen and for many within Hizmet. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of his biography. And by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, in fact, Gülen wrote, eyes again on a very long horizon, tied to no specific nation. And here is a long passage from Mr. Gülen. Quote, "Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview. and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on their way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian. No better than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fethullah Gülen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that, quote, difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fethullah Gülen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gülen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. A boy from Korajuk was now a frail, old man. And yet, Fethullah Gülen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven. He believed in resurrection. He believed in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gülen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They also were convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gülen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so, the end of Fethullah Gülen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gülen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding, because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation, and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you.
Questions? And you can ask, there's only one category you may not ask, which is personal. Politically, you may.
Yes. It has to be about people. I'm not.
I'd like to understand a little better Gülen's position towards secularism, which is a key issue in Turkey. Secularism is identified as secularism. The army stood behind it.
Yep.
And now he seems to be squeezed between this tradition, which I assume still exists in Turkey,
Oh, very much so.
Very much so. And on the other hand, what Erdogan is doing,
Political
practically a re-Islamization of Turkey.
Did everyone hear the question?
Oh,
Go ahead, Ori.
His attitude, Gülen's attitude towards secularism, which is still a very present and potent force within Turkey, and on the other hand, Erdogan, who speaks a much more, I would not say Islamic as much as Islamist sort of language, political Islamic language, and Gülen has always been caught between those two. So what is his view specifically about secularism? You go first.
All right, good. I'd like to hear what you think about that
I just
too.
have one thing I want to
Good. I think his thinking has evolved, honestly. His early experience with secularism was with the ruthlessness of the secular imposition in his childhood, youth, and upbringing. I mean, it was ruthless in the exclusion of any public role for Islam. That has ebbed and flowed depending on who was in power, and that was always the pretext for the military coups, was that Turkey was edging towards some kind of Sharia state, and that was often the accusation against Mr. Gülen, even though he has never had any such vision that I have been able to discern in his writings. As he has become more aware of global dynamics, and especially from his trip to Germany in 1977, his trip to the United States in 1982, and as he's become more aware of political situations, economic structures, and so forth, he's come to see, I think, that a secular state can in fact be a help to Islam. And so his attitude has been, his most recent articulations, that Islam flourishes best in a democratic society that does not seek to impose religion in any form, including in its Islamic form. So it's, there's been, I think, an evolution in his thinking over time.
I would just add two little things. One, to remind you that his birth date had for a long time been misgiven as 41, and apparently the reason is that when his father insisted on naming him Fethullah, right, which has the word Allah in his name, that the secular authorities were so intense under Ataturk that was forbidden.
Muhammad Fethullah.
Right, so they could not register his name until he was about 3, and then a friendly clerk, because his father was so well respected, said, "This is ridiculous, we'll register your son." So the confusion over his birth is a direct consequence of the thing that he was talking about, that Jon Pahl was talking about, in terms of the intensity of the secularist push under Ataturk, who was convinced that religion was the root of all evils and trying to organize a government. And so therefore you can't even express yourself religiously.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is Gülen made a comment, this is a good 10 years ago, I think. He said, atheists who are doing good works are doing God's work, they just don't realize it. So clearly what you said is absolutely true. He recognizes that one does not have to be, not only does not one have to be a person of a particular kind of faith, but one can be a person of faith as he understands faith, and still be guided to do good things. And he would say, well, it's because God's guiding you, you just don't realize it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, but it's a really complex question that you asked, and a very important one as well. But the distinctiveness of the secular imposition in Turkey is difficult for those of us who live with the First Amendment. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. I mean, we kind of breathe and live with this sort of pluralism that is not the case in Turkey. It never has been. Yeah.
Do you could you sort of synopsize the fundamental differences between Erdogan's theology and Gülen's theology? What are they at a theological schism as well as a political one, or is one driving the other?
Is one what?
Driving the other?
Driving the other. I haven't studied Erdogan's theology, and I frankly don't think there is a whole lot there.
I think
I mean, he was raised, you know, and schooled in the Naqshbandi Sufi tradition. But it seems to me what he's done is accommodated the faith to his political power. I mean, you just have to look at the way he's put it into practice in his private life and in his public policies. I mean, the man's home, the palace that he built for himself, has 1,100 rooms, right? Compare that with how Mr. Gülen has lived his entire life, right? He lives in a small 2-room apartment in the Poconos of Pennsylvania. Before that, tiny apartment in Istanbul, the 5th floor. Before that, tiny apartment in Izmir. Before that, he lived in a plywood shack outside the Kastana Pazari Mosque School. Before that, he lived in a window box in Edirne inside the mosque. So you just have the practical applications of whatever the theologies are in their lives, showing a rather different moral compass, at least between the two men. And you know, again, Gülen has empowered people to build schools, to engage in dialogue, and to foster social enterprises.
Tear schools down, closes them down.
Correct. And media enterprises. I mean, many of those social enterprises started by people of Hizmet, were newspapers, television stations, right? Magazines, etc., all of which were closed down by Erdogan and the government, assets seized, and filtered to his cronies through trusteeship. And the numbers are staggering. I mean, to the tune anywhere between 11 and 30 billion dollars are the numbers that I have seen circulated, and those are probably low as well when you take into account all of the assets that we're talking about, and real estate and equipment, and it doesn't even touch upon the social trauma inflicted by this arbitrary imposition of human rights violations on individuals associated with UN. So I don't know, the contrast seems to me is pretty stark. Whatever the theology of Erdogan happens to be, which I haven't studied.
I would agree that he has no real theology. When 9/11 happened, Gülen was one of the first people to speak out, and he said, you can't be a terrorist and be a true Muslim. I would apply that to Erdogan from a slightly different angle. You can't be a true Muslim, and what John just described, do what he has been doing over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I see, obviously I'm not a fan, right? I see Erdogan as a user of Islam when it is convenient so as to appeal to a certain base that he thinks he has by pretending to be a pious Muslim. But in fact, to make public exhibitions of your Islam is, in at least one school of Sunni thought, what I would call tertiary shirk. It's not acceptable.
It's associating false power with God's power.
Yeah.
No, that's really well put. And it goes back to what you were asking about. I mean, by scapegoating Gülen, Mr. Erdogan has united two very diverse factions within Turkey. The Kemalist left, who have never liked Gülen, or any Muslim for that matter, and political Islamists who use Islam to prop up their party power. And those two factions don't get along on much, but they currently agree that Gülen has been responsible for every single thing that's gone wrong in Turkey since 2010. Pretty much. Abdulhamid.
Yeah, thank you for wonderful presentation. I benefited and learned a lot. A little addition to your answer, this difference between Erdogan and Gülen, I guess the whole political Islamist perspective and this civil Islam differs in the sense that the political Islam puts the blame on others for all the problems, to Israel, America, colonialists, Westerners, whatever. So it doesn't make any self-reflection or self-critique. But this civil Islam, and it's coming from Nursi's tradition,
Yes.
prefers to look at mirror and see what are lacking as source of problems. So in the definition of Gülen or the Nursi, there are three main problems you all will know.
In the world, right.
The ignorance, the poverty, and the conflict, the main sources of the problems, not the colonialist.
Right.
Maybe, of course, a contribution to the problems, but not the mere source of the problem.
Right.
So then, of course, lots of differences continues with this diagnostic.
No, that's really, really helpful. I was just working on something and went back to the essay that Mr. Gülen wrote right before the military coup in 1980, and it was an essay on peace. And the question was, what produces peace? What brings about peace? And it was fascinating. He didn't talk about what happens politically. He talks about what happens individually, and then in the family, and then how that transforms society. And that's the basic difference between the two, as I see it, is that Erdogan sees things coming through the state from the top down. Mr. Gülen emphasizes individual practice of the faith that then is a leaven that transforms the society.
And my
Which
question,
also happens to accord with how democracy is supposed to work as
and if I can, my question is, you said the death of Mr. Gülen will not be end of Hizmet. So what kind of a future you foresee?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and that's why I'm a historian rather than a futurist. I don't have to live by those projections. But here's the pattern I see in history, Abdulani, is that every time the government has sought to clamp down on Mr. Gülen and on the emerging Hizmet movement, the movement actually, Mr. Gülen's credibility gained enhanced clarity, and the movement became stronger. So the best example of this is after the military coup in 1980, he was forced to go on the run for 6 years. I mean, he was on the most wanted list. Pictures were right there with anarchists and communists and leftists who the government was after. I mean, the military regime was hunting him down right now. I mean, it always had an element of political theater to it because everybody knew more or less where he was in Istanbul, where the 5th floor was. And so he'd get a tip, and then he would escape to Erzurum or to Izmir or wherever. But he was on the run for 6 years. Never preached, but was meeting with small groups wherever a safe house happened to be. And by circulating in that way, by being forced to become an itinerant, to go on the road, Hizmet grew from the ground up and actually became stronger than if he had simply stayed in Istanbul preaching in his pulpit. Now, this oppression is unprecedented, is ruthless, and is hunting people down all over the world. And the Turkish government's using millions of dollars comparatively in the U.S. to do so, right, compared to the resources that the Hizmet movement has available. But with consistent positive action, mushbet harakat, in those places where people can practice with integrity and continue doing what Mr. Gülen has inspired people to do right from the beginning, I see no reason why the movement can't grow and have a very bright future. Around the globe, Turkey's probably done for the foreseeable future, unless one of these strange events in history comes along, contingencies, and just things change overnight.
And I hope the same. It will be different. It will be different.
Right.
This is the anniversary of the death of a year ago, my best friend from college. We hadn't talked in about 25 years. He's in Portland, Oregon. I'm here. We just kind of got out of touch. But all year I've thought probably every day about him and thought about when he was alive, I knew I could pick up the phone or somehow we could be, suddenly that's no longer possible. So psychologically, it will be devastating when he goes. But I think that he has built something and inspired enough people with strong convictions and strong leadership qualities and a strong will to fulfill the kinds of projects that he has fostered, as you said, over
Yeah.
140 countries.
I don't know, I'd like to hear what you think.
They'll
thinking.
go on.
No, I mean, it's, here's the thing. If his leadership, if it was his charismatic leadership that was really the glue that has inspired people and held people together, then we could see, dissipation. We could see conflict, rivalry, which may occur in any event or any situation. If, in fact, people have taken his teachings and put them into practice in ways that are systemic and rooted and inspiring to new generations, then I think things will be fine.
He's really
And I honestly, I don't know.
Right, so people were reading his essays, like now they read yours.
Yeah, I suspect that's true. There will be a continuity there, but there will be change. No doubt, has to be on a global dynamic, and that's one of the ideas behind Istishara, right? Is that you go local, local, local. I mean, your consultation isn't just with the Abis and Ablas, the insiders, but you actually bring in and learn from and listen to all stakeholders who are involved. That's how a good social enterprise works. It's not just the quarterly profits of the shareholders that matter. It's what happens to all of the stakeholders who are involved in an enterprise. And I'm hoping that latter model will be the one that continues to develop in Nigeria and in Kenya and in Uganda and in Belgium and in Germany and in France and in Spain, here in the United States and Australia and New Zealand. You get the picture.
Any other question? Yes.
Maybe just one more, because you talked about the movement also here in the U.S. I guess I've been concerned about Gülen's own image in our country, and I wondered if you were doing your discussions for your book, what did you find was that image when you talked to me people here? Because I suppose there's always a little bit of worry that our government could decide to send that.
By and large, that's trickier than it appeared immediately. In many circles, Mr. Gülen is deeply respected, especially in circles where there are academics who have taken time to study his life and works, where there have been conferences, places like Georgetown and so on and so forth. I can't speak to how people perceive him in the State Department these days. Perhaps Jack can say a word or two. But I think, at least under a previous administration, there was deep regard for the potential that his civil Islam held up for the rest of the Muslim world as well. And you see this evident in the fact that President Obama made his first official state visit to Turkey in 2008, right? So clearly people knew that whatever was going on in Turkey, there was a leaven there was something that was worth holding on to, and that allowed him to stay here as well to negotiate the perilous visa process as well. But under the current administration, who knows? There is no moral compass operating at the leadership of our country right now, and the president is none. And so caprice and arbitrary policies like the one that came down today, abandoning the Kurds, is entirely possible. I could see President Trump and his next phone call with President Erdogan in response to a request to extradite him, saying, okay, we'll sell you X number of cruise missiles, and you buy those, and we'll sell you this sheikh.
But you have to take Biden to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad joke, but yeah, I know, it's terrifying to see. But I hope saner voices and perspectives will prevail in our government to prevent this kind of martyrdom, because that's basically what it would be sending
It is an uphill battle because Mr. Erdogan controls
the media.
completely. So that we were talking just before about the New Yorker article.
Dexter Filkins.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
And I read it and I was outraged.
Yeah, it's
because
terrible.
from my point of view, he hadn't done something.
No.
And he just bit the party line and spewed it out.
Yeah.
In a respectable publication, I thought this is unforgivable.
Yeah.
So it's an uphill battle.
It is. And again, because of the way he's been framed, and because of these deep tropes within journalism, and to a degree within the academy, that are suspicious of religion, that are suspicious of Islam in particular, and that are suspicious of people who seem too earnest. I mean, it's weird to say this, but people who are too earnest get dismissed. You know? And it's nuts. Oh, it can't be true. There must be some nefarious motive operating underneath, behind it all. And, you know, I keep looking for it. I mean, I was raised at the University of Chicago in the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? I mean, that's my bread and butter as a scholar. And I've been looking, and I've been trying to find, okay, where's the nefarious political intent, and where's the evidence of that in Gülen and the people of Hizmet? I'm not finding it. I am finding a lot of really earnest, hardworking, dedicated, smart, faithful, altruistic people. And it seems, the fact that it seems too good to many people to believe is a commentary on those people, far more than it is on the movement and Mr. Gülen. Look at the evidence and see. I mean, that's really all I ask.
Buy his book, 5 copies.
Yeah, no,
Read the evidence.
I don't get royalties from it, so that's not my motive in this particular
No,
case.
it's
Yeah.
important book.
Thank you very much.
A minor question, like
Yeah.
I think it was CBS 60 Minutes did a documentary a few years ago. What was your feeling about that?
I didn't see that.
It didn't make me as mad as the next one.
Not as mad, no, but it still was following some of the same kind of tropes. You know, it's too good to be true. Can they really be building schools in these really poor neighborhoods just for the sake of, lifting kids out of poverty and educating them? Can that really be the case? So there was a little bit of, kowtowing to the conspiracy theorists that somehow or another Gülen's part of the, deep state. But it was better than Filkins, who really, it was awful. And the guy's smart, he's clever, he's lived in Turkey. I mean, it was really a shame. And just religiously tone deaf. He looked for the he cherry-picked the worst possible nightmare scenarios to represent Gülen and Hizmet. And it's unfortunate, but that's the uphill battle we're dealing with, Uri. I think you put it really well.
Did you come with a speech to Philippines after that?
No, I did not. I mean, he wouldn't listen to me, right?
Just curious.
In all likelihood. And that's part of the struggle with the book, too, is, sort of getting it out there in front of people like him, those opinion makers, the major media outlets, and so forth. I mean, they're not always ready to listen as of yet. Okay. I'm hoping that, we'll see.
And on that cheerful note,
Thank you very
Thank you
much
all
for
very
coming.
much.
And I look forward to individual conversations and reach out to me on Facebook and Twitter. You zoomed through me. Brushed up on my, it was good.